Hi everyone, I'm Jen Lucas, managing editor of the Knitting Circle, and welcome to today's Q&A for the Knitting Circle. Before I get to our guest, I just want to remind everybody that we have a chat box underneath where you're watching the video, and be sure to leave all your questions there. We'll get through as many as we can in the hour. And in addition to that, you're going to want to check out underneath the video, there will be a link to a free pattern download for today. And today's pattern is the Summer Striped Dishcloth, which I have right here. And it's just a really easy two-color dishcloth pattern. It actually comes with the instructions to make the dishcloth or the larger placemat size. So this is a perfect project for summer, and really you could make this for just about any time of year. So be sure that you're going and downloading the pattern and leaving your questions down in the chat box. And also in the chat box, if you want to say
Here.
hello, tell us where you're from, that would be great. So now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest for today. This month we have back Michele Lee Bernstein, who is an instructor here on the Knitting Circle. She's also a great knitting instructor in person and on Zoom. She's a knitting designer and soon to be book author, and I'm so excited to have her with us today. Hi, Michele. Michele, can you hear me? I don't think Michele can hear us, so we'll go ahead and get started. We do have some questions coming in, and our first, oh, Michele can't hear us. Yeah, okay, hold on. Okay, are you good now, Michele?
I have just gotten you back. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yes, all right, we're good. Now we're good to go. We already have a few questions for you. I'm so glad to have you
Okay.
here today.
All right. Sorry, I missed whatever you said, so
Okay,
I'm back now, and hopefully it doesn't do that again. And if it does, we're gonna see if we can do something else.
yeah.
What are
Well,
you?
basically, I just introduced you and said you're a really great knitting instructor and soon to be book author, and I was really glad that you're here with us today.
All right. Thank you. I'm really
Great.
glad to be here with you too.
All right, so we'll go ahead and just dive right into questions if you're ready.
Sure.
All right, great. Our first question is from Margaret, and Margaret wants to know, how can you neatly make the last bind off stitch? Mine is always bigger than the rest of the stitches on the row.
So I don't pay too much attention to that. I know there are things. I have looked them up. I have done them occasionally. If you want, Google is a great thing. Some
Mhm.
people knit the last two stitches together and then finish, but it doesn't usually matter to me because I'm taking that end and sewing it in. It's usually at the end of a shawl or at the end of a circular thing, and I'm going to hide it anyway. So I don't fuss too much with it. How about you?
Yeah, I'm the same. What I actually do now, and it's something that I never really thought about too much until we started working on the Knitting Circle videos, is I believe Jill Wright actually did a video on this, and she does knit the last two stitches together of the bind off, and it does make a difference, especially when you're just using like a regular standard bind off, just knitting those two together. And then the other thing I do too is, for a long time when I would bind off, you have that final loop. And so I would take my tail and I would sort of bring it through that loop again to secure it. But for the vast majority of bind offs, you don't actually need to do that. You can just pull on the loop and like bring the tail out so you don't have that like extra little nubbin of yarn. So those are a couple things that you could try. But yes,
Oh,
also if my bind off looks a little wonky at the end, I also do, like you, use the yarn tail to to fix it, weave it in a little tighter. So yeah, that
let me
always
add
helps
one
too.
thing though.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know that when you talked about just pulling it up through the
Mm-hmm.
last stitch, that is a great thing, especially when you're knitting in the round. So
Mm-hmm.
wait, you cut the yarn, you pull it up straight, and then you look at the top of your knitting, and you know that when you're knitting in the round, you're really knitting a spiral, right? So
Mm-hmm.
one end is higher than the other end, the finishing end.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you take that tail and you loop it through the first stitch to just imitate the rest of those chains, and then take it back down through the last stitch and snug it up and then sew it in, and it makes your circle be on the same level and it makes it very neat and tidy.
Yeah, I like to do that too, especially with the working in the round. It always drives me crazy when you have like that little the difference,
Yep.
yeah, between the two. All right, we have another question from Christine, and Christine would like to know, is there a good way to reinforce the heel bottom right after the gusset? I find my knitted socks wear out at that spot more than anywhere else.
Are you using a special stitch like heel stitch or eye of partridge? That helps a little bit. The other thing you can do, there is something called woolly nylon, and it is just a thin, thin strand of, I don't know, woolly nylon.
Mhm.
And if you knit it along with your heel, it can also help you reinforce your heel down there at the bottom. Another thing I recommend is get really, really familiar with duplicate stitch because that is a great way to reinforce after things start wearing a little thin. You want to do it before your heel wears all the way through.
Yeah, those are really great tips. I was going to say the same thing with getting that nylon thread and knitting that along, especially in the heel part, because I know for most people that's where the socks tend to wear out first. So yeah, great tips there. Yeah, and like you said, with doing the eye of partridge or slip stitch heel, you could even continue those slip stitches on if you're doing the heel turn part, where normally you're just sort of knitting and purling on the actual like heel turn part of your heel. You could continue the slip stitches there as well. Obviously, you're going to be adding more bulk than if you just use like a nylon thread, like Michele said, but that's something you could try too. So there's so many different ways to knit heels. And I actually have found that in trying different heels, different ones tend to wear out faster for me. I don't know if you've ever experienced that. And so what I will sometimes do is just try a different heel. So, for example, when I would knit a heel flap and a gusset, um, those would tend to wear out a lot faster for me than if I did something like a short row heel. So a lot of times now I use a short row heel instead of like the heel flap, heel turn gusset situation, because in that situation, I find that my heels wear out faster. So, okay, let's see if we have any more questions here. Let's see. Seems like Michele might be muted again, so we're just going to keep going until we get her back here. So Jan wants to know, how do you address a yarn over twice? It's a YO2, so I think that's yarn over twice or 2 times yarn over on the purl row where there is no, let's see, access stitch, and the row count will be off if you only purl once through it. Okay, so I think that the question is, how do you address a yarn over twice when you're on a purl row? So if you're yarning over twice, you always have to remember that unless the pattern tells you otherwise, that you're going to want to yarn over, do your yarn overs on the one side, and then on the other side where you're purling, you're going to still need to do a purl into the yarn over, the first yarn over, and then knit into the second yarn over. So if you have a pattern that's just telling you to purl all the stitches on the wrong side, but you have a double yarn over on the right side, you are going to have to purl one and knit one, or knit one and purl one. It doesn't really matter. Um, so that's how you would address that. Again, in some patterns, you might only be working into that double yarn over one time and actually changing the stitch count. But in most cases, when you're doing multiple yarn overs together, you have to purl one, then knit one, or knit one, then purl one. So I think that should answer that for you, Jan, hopefully. And then let's see, now we have a question from Barbara. Barbara wants to know, purl 2 together, yarn over, how to get your stitches back after 2 rows of this. I started with 114 and ended up with 22. So if you're doing a purl 2 together yarn over, you should be maintaining the same stitch count for every single row, if I think I'm understanding your question correctly. So when you're doing a purl 2 together yarn over, you're going to do purl 2 together yarn over, purl 2 together yarn over, and so on and so on and so on. So the purl 2 together will be taking away 1 stitch because that's 2 stitches going into 1, and then your yarn over will be adding another stitch in. So you should be maintaining the same stitch count if you're just doing repeatedly purl two together yarn overs all the way across. It should be creating like some kind of eyelet type pattern. So hopefully I answered that one for you too. Michele is having some technical difficulties, so she is going to try to come back in here in a couple minutes. But in the meantime, I will continue to answer your questions. So if you want to go ahead and leave your questions down in the chat box, feel free to do that, or let me know what you're knitting and we can talk about that too. Don't forget that we also have a free pattern for you to download today, and that is the Summer Stripes dishcloth pattern right here. Very cute. I used two colors to knit it. This pattern actually has a photo tutorial. And if you go to our Knitting Circle website and scroll down to live streaming events, you actually will find where I actually knit that one live. So you can see how I did it up close and personal. So I'm not seeing any questions just yet. Let's see if there's anything else we want to go back and talk about. Oh, here we go. Here we have one from Kelly. Is there specific yarns for specific projects? I'm new to the craft. So that's a really great question. So there's so much we can do in terms of talking about yarn. So, I mean, it's nearly endless when it comes to yarn. So as far as yarn goes, yes, there sort of is specific yarn for specific projects. So a lot of times when you're working from a pattern, you will see that that pattern calls for a specific yarn. Now that could just be a worsted weight yarn, which will tell you the thickness of the yarn, or it could also tell you that you need XYZ name brand of yarn. So really what's important when you're looking for yarn to go with your pattern is if you want your project to look exactly like the pattern, I mean color, everything, you're going to want to, in most cases, just buy the exact yarn that's listed in the pattern. But not every pattern always tells you buy this specific brand of yarn in this specific color. In that case, you're going to want to look at the yarn weight, maybe if they list the content of the yarn, whether it's wool or cotton or something like that, you would want to look at that as well in terms of determining what yarn you want to use. We do have a lot of videos here on the Knitting Circle. If you are new to the craft about yarn, we have a really great one on determining yarn weights. So it explains all the different thicknesses of yarn. We have videos that explain using different sized needles with different yarns. So take a look at some of those free videos that we have, and I think that that will really help you. So let's see, do we have Michele back here yet? Oh, I can't hear you still. Okay. Well, we'll just keep going and I'll keep answering some questions while we're working to figure that one out. Let's see. Jeannie asks, I'm doing a sweater in the round from the bottom up and plan to steek. The pattern I'm using as a guide has a round neck, but I want a V-neck and I'm having trouble figuring out how to do it. Okay, well, that is a very tall order that you have there as far as steeking a sweater. For those of you who don't know, steeking a sweater is the process of when you want to basically make a cardigan and you don't want to knit back and forth in rows. A lot of people don't like to purl. And in addition to that, if you're doing color work, it's much easier to work in the round. And that's typically where you'll see steeking used, not always. And so, first of all, so what she wants to do is she wants to basically knit her sweater in the round and then scarily cut it up the middle in order to make it into a cardigan, and then you would make a button band. So for those of you who don't know what steeking is, that's sort of like a high level explanation of steeking. And I know that Michele does know a lot about steeking, so if we get her back, we can talk about this some more. But as far as going from a round neck to a V-neck, that's going to be a little bit tricky as far as the steeking goes, because typically with the steeking, you're sort of working all the way up, the middle. And so typically you do have a round neck. So I would think if I was going to be steeking something I wanted to turn into a V-neck, what I would do is this. So when you are steeking, you have about maybe 5 or 7 stitches in the middle that are sort of those waist stitches for where you can cut up the center. I think the best way to go about this is that you would have to almost start doing some decreases in the actual sweater while increasing probably in the steek, just so that things don't get too tight maybe on your needles. And so if you're working those decreases for the V or for your V-neck sweater and then adding increases into your steek, because then you're going to cut the steek anyway, so it won't matter that you have those increases there. Sort of just off the top of my head, I think that could be a solution to your problem. Unfortunately, it's one of those things that you might want to just take a little bit of waste yarn and make maybe just a tiny little swatch and work it out to see if it'll actually work before you go forward and try to steek your whole sweater. Steeking is something that I know is scary to a lot of people, and I'm hoping that we can get some steeking videos up on the Knitting Circle soon so that we can show you all how to do it. It's something I've actually never tried before either. I have started a sweater where I plan to steek it, but I haven't finished the sweater yet. But I think I'm sort of leaving it off in the corner because I'm scared about the cutting my knitting part. Michele, do we have you back? No, we still don't. Okay. Not sure what's going on there. Let's see. Yeah, hopefully we can get Michele back here. She knows a lot about steeking and color work especially, but if not, we'll get her on the next one for sure. Let's see. Christine says that on socks, they like to use 8 or 9-inch circulars. And then Monique says, I've not tried 9-inch circulars yet. I'm thinking about trying a pair with flexible needles now that it's been a while since I knit socks. So if you like to knit socks, trying 8 or 9-inch circulars it's a really fun technique, but I will say it's not for everyone. So there are so many different ways that you can knit your socks. You can obviously use double pointed needles, DPNs. You can use 2 circular needles together to knit your socks. You can use the magic loop method. That's my personal preference. And you can use 9-inch circulars. And so the 9-inch circular is just a very small circumference needle. It's really only 9 inches in circumference, and you can use that to knit your entire sock. And so even when you get to the heel and you want to work back and forth in rows, you actually can still do it on the 9-inch circular. I personally, when I tried the 9-inch circular, it wasn't for me. I find that I need a slightly longer needle to hold on to. And so for me, the 9-inch circular, the actual needle part, physical, like, straight part of the knitting needle was a little too short. I just couldn't quite get comfortable with my hands on those 9-inch circulars, but I know a lot of people who really do love them. And I that's one thing I really love about sock knitting especially, is that there's so many options on how you can knit your socks. So you can use all these different types of needles. There's so many different types of yarn. You can go toe up, cuff down. Just today on the Knitting Circle Facebook group, I saw somebody knit this incredible pair of socks where they were pieces where they were worked from the centered out and joined. It was like this cool sock that looked like it was like almost like granny hexagons in crochet, but it was knitting. I mean, so there's so many different ways that you can knit socks. And so it's really interesting for everyone to share what they like to use for their sock knitting or circular knitting. And even those 9-inch circulars, I know some people, when they're doing things like baby sweaters and stuff, will use them for the sleeves on baby sweaters as well. So lots of uses for those short circumference needles. Kelly asks, what's a good beginner project? Well, to plug our free pattern, I actually think that the Summer Stripes dishcloth, even though it's 2 colors, I think that this would be a really great beginner project. And again, we do have a video that I did. It was live streaming, and there's photos in the pattern on how to do this. So I think that this would be a really great way to start. Another great project is we actually have a 14-day Learn to Knit series on the Knitting Circle. So if you just go to the site and look for that, you will find it. And in that series, we have a cowl pattern. And so it's just a short cowl. I don't know, can I see it? Oh, it's right here. Let me pull it out for you. Oh, losing some knitting here. So this is the cowl from the 14-day Learn to Knit series. And so it sort of just goes over all the basic stitches that you need to know. And it is just a tiny cowl, sort of close to neck, one that you would kind of stuff in your coat in the wintertime. But you certainly could make it longer if you wanted to make a scarf even or something like that. So I think something like this or dishcloth, I think those are good beginner projects. I actually never recommend that people start with a scarf. The story I always tell is when my sister, I was teaching her how to knit, and then we decided that we were going to make my mom Christmas present, and she was going to make the scarf because she was new to knitting and only really had interest in doing the knit stitch, and I would make the hat since I knew how to, do the decreases and knitting around and stuff. But like many beginner knitters, she got about a foot and a half into the scarf and became bored and gave me a call and frantically on, December 22nd saying, I don't have mom's scarf done. And I had to go pick it up from her and finish it. So I don't recommend starting with a scarf necessarily. I think things like dishcloths, cowls, even things like hats, you can find hat patterns where they are knit flat, but even really starting out knitting in the round is really not as hard as you think. So don't be afraid to just, if you find a pattern, try it. I know people who have started their first project as a sweater, and that's just because they saw the sweater, they wanted to knit it, and they figured it out as they went. So let's see, do we have Michele back yet? I don't think we do. Oh, bummer. Well, we'll have to get Michele on, and maybe we can get her later on in the stream, or if not, we'll definitely have her back because I just love chatting with Michele about everything, knitting related. So yeah, going back to beginner projects, really the sky's the limit. Like I said, I recommend starting with something smaller, but if you really want to knit that scarf, go for it. But I like telling people to start with something like a dishcloth or cowl or something like that. So that's all the questions I'm seeing right now. If you do have questions or comments, let me know what you're knitting. We can talk about that too. Don't forget to leave your comment down below, and don't forget to get that free pattern. Jeannie says, thank you for your swatch suggestion. Never thought of it. And she would like to see some steeking videos. Yes, and those are some things because I actually think we talked about this last time with Michele when she was on a couple months ago, that I have never actually steeked something before. I'm working on the sweater that I've been working on for a while, but I've never done it. But Michele has done a lot of steeking, and so I think it would be really fun to do even a live video similar to what we're doing here, where Michele walks me through how to steek something. I think that would be really cool. But we also wanted to put some videos on the website to show you how to steek, because that is a very popular technique. Colorwork sweaters especially are always a popular project that people are working on. And so people always want to know how to steek those sweaters. And there's other things you can steek too besides just sweaters, but that's the most common place that you will see those the steeking technique used. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? So going back to maybe specific yarn for specific projects. So like I said before, there's so many different things that you can use as far as yarn goes. But if you're making something like socks, for example, I'll start with that since we were talking about socks earlier. You typically do want to find a yarn that has some wool content, although some people do have an allergy to wool. But typically for things like socks, you're going to find a lot of sock yarns are a 75% superwash merino wool with a 25% nylon content. I personally love to be a little bit fancy when I'm making socks, and so sometimes I'll find yarns that are maybe 80% wool, 10% nylon, and even 10% cashmere. That's really nice yarn to have. When you're making something like, for example, the free pattern that we have for this month, the summer striped dishcloth, you're going to want to look for that worsted weight dishcloth cotton. I actually have some right here. Let's see. Here you go. So this is a worsted weight dishcloth cotton. You can find this at any big box craft store, even just large chain stores. If they have a yarn section, they'll have they'll have the dishcloth cotton. And this would be a really great yarn to make anything for your kitchen. I even love to make baby bibs out of this. That's another really great beginner project. So that's something like when you're doing a specific project, you might want a specific yarn, and that would be the dishcloth cotton. And then when it comes to things like sweaters and knitting a sweater, I would say it's pretty important to think about what type of yarn you want to use in that case as well. For example, I wouldn't say I'm allergic to wool, but I'm sensitive to wool. So I tend to get a little itchy when I wear a lot of different wools. And so I have made some beautiful sweaters over the years, and then I never, ever wear them because they make me itch. So, and I'm somebody that also tends to run a little bit warm. So the thought of having to wear like a long sleeve shirt underneath, an already heavy wool sweater, that just sounds like I'm going to be way too hot, and I'm not really interested in that either. So over the years, I've really had to think about what type of yarn do I feel comfortable wearing. And most of the time I don't like wearing, hold on here. Okay. Most of the time I don't like wearing wool, and I don't like wearing really heavy fabrics. And so I found I really like cotton bamboo blends for my sweaters. Even though like in the winter, it might not be the warmest thing out there. I find that it's really nice for sweaters for me. That's what works for me. So just over time, you have to just sort of experiment and see what works for you. So let's see if we have any more questions here. Not seeing any. So let's see. Okay, so I'm going to just kind of go back to the beginning and talk a little bit more about binding off. And so when we are binding off, there's so many different ways to do it. And so we already sort of talked about the way if you have that loose stitch, you can knit 2 stitches together at the end, and that's a really great way to fix your stitches. But the other thing too is that there are tons of different ways to bind off. So if one particular bind off isn't working for you, you can try different bind off. On our website, we have tons of different bind off videos. For example, one of my favorite bind offs to do, especially on things like shawls, it's knit 2 together through the back loop. And so I'll knit 2 together through the back loop all the way across the entire, I use this particularly on shawls because I need my bind off to be loose on a shawl. And so, that's a really great bind off. So you can really just go and experiment with lots of different bind offs and see which one works best for you. Let's see, do we have Michele back yet? Nope. Okay, so moving on. Let's see. Oh, Monique asked a question about socks. Do you prefer to have a pattern on the top of your sock for the foot, or just wait to start any stitch pattern on the leg of the sock? So this sounds like Monique is knitting her socks maybe from the toe up. So she wants to know about putting a pattern on the top of the sock, or just wait to the foot. And so that really is one of those personal preference things. Over the years, my favorite thing to knit is just plain old socks, just stockinette stitch, work, typically with self-striping yarn. That's my favorite thing to do. If I am knitting something with a pattern, I do have a tendency to put the pattern on the top of the sock. I like the way, just from a knitting standpoint, I just enjoy the act of knitting a sock where the stitch pattern's coming all the way on the foot and then it goes all the way around the leg. I've also seen some really cool things where you might even just have like a panel coming down onto the foot, can be really nice. There's so many options and there's so many patterns out there. So there's just really so many different ways that you can do the socks, but it's really up to you. I personally, if I'm gonna do a pattern, I'm gonna put it on the top of the sock as well, of the foot. But most of the time I'm just knitting plain, sort of self-striping. Oh, I have lots of knitting back here today, like this. This is the kind of sock I mostly knit, which this particular one is top down with a German short row heel. This one's actually in a worsted weight yarn, but this is typically when I'm knitting socks, this is how I like to do it. Let's see. Oh, we have a question from Dolores. Dolores says, how do you read charts? If the row is listed with odd numbers, do you knit the same pattern for the even row? Okay, that's a really great question, Dolores. So, as far as it goes for reading charts, so yes, so if you have a chart and only the odd numbers are listed, so you have like 1, 3, 5, 7, obviously those are the odd numbers, that those are going to be your right side rows. If there are no wrong side rows listed, typically the pattern should be telling you somewhere what you should be doing on that wrong side. But if it's not, I'm not going to say always, because you know there's always exceptions to the rule, but on the even rows, which typically would be your wrong side, you would just be purling those stitches back. So typically if the even numbered rows are missing on a chart, it usually means that nothing's happening on that row. And so you either would be knitting or purling. If it's a lace shawl, again, it's really going to depend on the stitch pattern and things, but typically you would be doing knit stitches with lace or whatever on your chart on the right side row, and the wrong side typically is what I call a rest row, where you would just be purling. But if it's a good pattern, it's going to tell you that, you know, even rows are just purled. And I know sometimes for me, when I'm writing a knitting pattern, if I have a chart and the chart is gigantic, you know, there's only so much room that you can really use, you know, when you're writing a pattern. Like, you don't want your pattern to be 25 pages long. Sometimes you do need to cut out those even rows, but then you know, hopefully you're telling the person what to do on those rows. But most likely you're just going to be purling on those rows. Let's see. So Jeannie wants to know, how do you organize your yarn by type, color, weight, which works for you? You know, I'm kind of a mishmash of all of that. So for me, what I like to do is sort of organize it by yarn weight. Like back here, this is just more because it looks nice, right? In my background. But in my basement, I actually have a cedar closet. And so I have my yarn stored in plastic totes down there. So all of my sock yarn that I'm going to knit specifically socks, so it's all this sort of self-striping yarn business, that's all together, because if I want to knit a pair of socks, I'm going to just go there and you know, pick something out of there. Other than that, I pretty much have it organized by yarn weight. If I do have sweater quantities of yarn, which I'm somebody that doesn't have a lot of sweater quantities of yarn in my stash, I do sort of keep all the sweater quantities together in a tote, just so if I'm in the mood to knit a sweater, I can go right to where that plastic tote is and see what sweater amounts I have. So, but there's lots of different ways to organize your yarn. I think most people do it by yarn weight, because when you are, you know, starting a knitting project, you're going to need to know, oh, I need this weight of yarn. So I think that's how most people do it. But I also do love, you know, seeing on Pinterest and things like that, or Instagram, people who have, you know, organized their yarn by rainbow order or something. It looks beautiful. I love how it looks, but for me, that's not really a practical way to organize my yarn, just because then when it's like, oh, I need a bulky weight yarn, it's like, well, in this beautiful rainbow, where's the bulky weight yarn? But again, it's personal preference. It's really, you know, what you want to do, but by yarn weight pretty much works for me. Let's see. Sarah wants to know, can you tell?
No.
Oh, wait, Michele, can we hear you?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Yes?
It looks like
No?
you might be a little delayed, but I
Okay.
can hear you now.
We'll see how long this
Okay,
lasts.
yay. Oh, well, this is perfect that we got you back just in time. This is a perfect question for you. Sarah wants to know, can you talk about blocking, particularly shawls? Do I need the foam mats to pin my shawl to?
It depends on what kind of shawl you have.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's lace, and you're going to want to open up those eyelets. Those foam mats are super helpful. You can also use your bed if you don't want to sleep on it that night. I used to use a cardboard cutting board that was for sewing instead of using the foam mats. You get floor tiles that are rubber from someplace like Harbor Freight or Canadian Tire or Costco that are 2 foot by 2 foot. I just don't have room to store those. So I like the 1 foot by 1 foot. If your shawl is just a garter stitch shawl and you don't need to pin it out in any particular size or to open up eyelets, then you don't need them. But I am a big believer in them. I believe for the Knitting Circle, I have a blocking tutorial. Yes, I do.
Yes, you
So
do. Mm-hmm.
it's a video and you should watch it because it's very helpful.
Yeah. I was going to say the same thing. You don't absolutely need to have the foam mats. Before I had the foam mats, I used to put a towel down on my carpet and just do it that way. But the foam mats do make it easy. And like Michele said, if you have room to buy those 2 feet by 2 feet ones from, the hardware store, big box store, something like that, those can be really nice. Some people will even like block it on a bed too, like a bed that's obviously nobody needs to use for a couple days. But I always just kind of like to put towels or something down if I'm going to block on something that's not a mat. Let's see. Okay. Oh, looks like we're going to talk steeking with Michele next month, so we can talk about that without technical problems. Awesome.
Yes.
Well, you asked this question in the chat, but let's talk about it. So, you asked, do you knit all summer long with wool, or do you change it up with linen or cotton for the summer? I knit all summer long with just about any yarn out there. How about you?
I do too. And right now I'm working on stuff for my book, so most of it's wool. In fact, I think all of it's wool. And it is anywhere from fingering weight on up to super bulky. And I'm blessed to be able to have air conditioning in my house, so I I can knit all summer long.
Yeah, I'm the same. And I will say, if I'm taking my yarn sort of out and about in the summer, outside where it's hot,
Yes.
then I still will knit with whatever yarn, but usually it's like a smaller project, like a hat or a sock. I'm not taking the wool sweater or the large
No.
crocheted blanket out with
No.
me to go work on outside in the summertime. But yeah, I really will use just about any kind of yarn any time of year. It doesn't really matter to me.
We just like
Um, yeah. Dolores wants to know if we have a video to learn how to read charts. Yes, we do, and Michele made it, so you should go check it out. Um, I think it's just called "How to Read a Knitting Chart," and there might be a couple other videos that touch on that subject, but we do have a video on reading charts, and I love knitting from charts. How about you, Michele?
I love charts. I get lost when I have to read through the line of text and I look away and then I come back and I
Mhm.
don't know which little symbol, which BRK or A2 tog or whichever that I was looking at. So the charts are really helpful. The chart is just a picture of what the front side of your knitting looks like as you're looking at it.
Yeah.
And that is,
Do you have any tips if people, well, I'm sure it's in the video too, but do you have any tips if people have trouble reading charts? Like, what do you normally suggest to people if there's somebody that has trouble? Do you have any like little tricks you use when you're reading charts? Uh-oh, I think we lost Michele again. Well, I'll list my tips for reading charts. So, when I'm reading from a chart, what I like to do is take a sticky note and actually put it so I'm covering up the rows above where I'm going to work. And so basically, what happens is, like, let's say I'm working row 3 of a chart. I will take my sticky note, and so it's blocking row 4 and above. And so that way I look just below the sticky note. I can see row 3, which I'm working, and then I can also see the previous rows that I've worked, which can sometimes be helpful when you're knitting from the chart, if you can kind of see on the chart your previous rows. So that's one tip if you're new to reading charts. A lot of people will want to take the sticky note, and if they're on row 3, they might block off rows 2 and 1 with a sticky note, and that works too, and that might work for you in your brain. But I actually found taking the sticky note and blocking off the chart where I haven't worked yet is actually more helpful for me. The other thing you can do is if you take your chart and put it in like a plastic sleeve, like, if you're going to like put it in a binder or something, you can use highlighter tape. You can use washi tape, like the cute little washi tape for, decorating your planner or whatever. You could use that to keep track. It doesn't necessarily have to be a sticky note. But those are just some tips I like to use when I'm trying to read from a chart. And yeah, then definitely go check out the video on reading charts as well. That'll be very helpful. I'm just going to quickly skip over one question and answer Sarah's question really quickly. Oh yeah, you are back. There we go.
Are not with me today. The
Ah,
internet went down and it's back.
okay. Well, that's good.
So
Okay,
sorry.
so let's circle back. So, do you have any tips for anybody reading, learning to read charts? I said like use a sticky note to
Yes, either
help
use a
you.
sticky note or highlighter tape. But
Yeah,
if you're using a sticky note, you want to put that sticky note above the line on the chart where you're working. Did you already mention that?
yeah, I
So that
did.
you can
'Cause
see the
yes,
things line up under. See, these are the very important things you need to know.
yeah, yeah. Because I
There are
used to
also magnet boards you could use.
Oh yeah, the magnet boards. Yeah, I used to use that too. You can actually like on Etsy and stuff even find people that make different boards, or you can buy them also from different yarn stores. But I had one where somebody on Etsy made the where the pattern would go in, and then you could buy the cute little magnet too. So it's really
Yes.
just experimenting and finding which one you like
Can I
best.
put a
Yeah.
plug in for something?
Oh,
It
go
is
right ahead. Yes,
it's
please.
Knit Companion, and it's for
Mhm.
either Android devices or iOS devices,
Mhm.
and it's an app that you put on your tablet or your phone. Um, and the basic model of it is free, and you can put any PDF in there, which is most of your knitting patterns. And there's a line that goes across, and there's a line that goes up and down, and you can scoot the lines around. And what I really love about it is you can zoom in on your pattern, so you can make it big so that you can see it, because I need that help.
Mhm.
Um, Also, what else did I want to tell you about it? You can put any PDF in there. So if you're taking a class, an online class, and you get a PDF, you can put the instructions for that in there too and just zoom it up big.
Yeah.
I highly
I,
recommend.
Yeah, I think Knit Companion too, aren't there, and maybe these are paid for features of that app, but I think that you can even make it so you can only like view one line of a chart at a time. And like there's even some where parts where you can like rearrange, like literally rearrange the pattern to
Yes,
like have the written instruction with the chart. I mean, so it is something cool to check out if you are a technology person, and like the technology for your knitting and crochet. Or I've even used just the Goodreader app on my phone to sort of blow up a part of a pattern or make notes on a pattern too. Like if I don't have, I personally like my pattern printed out on a piece of paper, but sometimes you don't always have that available.
I know.
Yeah. Oh, going back to the blocking question really quickly, and then we have a few more questions. Sarah wanted to know what kind of pins you use for blocking. That's a really great question.
This is so important. You
Mhm.
want to make sure that your pins are either stainless steel or nickel plated. You don't want something that can rust. I had a sample done for a that was in a book somewhere, and the test knitter had wet blocked it, and she had used pins and not really looked, and rust was on the sample. She had to knit the whole thing over again.
Yeah.
That was kind of sad. So you definitely want pins that are rust proof. And I like the T pins, so they look like this, and they have the little T across
Hmm.
the top instead of the little button heads, the little round ones, because then it just pop off over the head.
Yeah. And the other one more thing I will say about the rust proof or stainless steel pins is that I had a set, well, I had a lot of sets, a lot of pins. I knit a lot of shawls, so I have a lot of pins. But I had some pins that I had had for a very long period of time, like 10 years or something. And I did actually find that for years, no problem with rust. And then
I don't know if you can hear me, but I can't hear you.
oh, okay, I can hear you, but I guess you can't hear me now. Uh-oh.
Yep.
Um, so with the pins, because they were so old, I did find that I did start getting rust on my knits. So that's like another thing too, is if they do say that they're rust proof or stainless steel, that's great. But if you're going to keep them around for 10 years or something, might be time to replace them, because that's what happened to me. Is all of a sudden I had a shawl. I was like, what's that little spot on there? I'm like, wait, these are rust proof. But again, they were very, very old pins. So Michelle, can you hear me? I don't think you can, or we can't hear you again. Okay, we're going to just keep going. Let's see. We have somebody that has a question about a specific pattern. So let's see if I can figure this out really quick. So somebody has listed a line of a pattern, and basically it has a Pearl 1K1, and then it has 5, and then in brackets 89999 times. So does this mean I only repeat P1K1 5 times? So the answer is yes, depending on your size. So basically what you're seeing there, where you have the 5 and then the numbers in the brackets, and if you're wondering what I'm talking about, there's a question in my chat that lists a specific line of the pattern if you want to see it. So it's K1P1 in parentheses, and then it has a 5, and then in brackets 89999 times. Does this mean I would P1K1 5 times? Yes, depending on the size. So the 5, 8, 9, 9, and so on, those are all for the different sizes. So if you're making the smallest size, you would do P1K1 5 times. The next size up, you would P1K1 8 times, and so on. And so when I have that type of pattern, I find that the easiest thing to do is to go through the entire pattern and either with a pencil circle all the sizes, or I actually like to take a highlighter, and like if it's a printed out pattern, I will highlight my sizes. Can you hear me now, Michelle? Okay, great. Yes, I can hear you. We're like a cell phone commercial. Okay. All right.
And
So
I agree with you about the highlighting your pattern size all the way through. Definitely. And
and
read through all the way to the end of the pattern before you start knitting, because there might be something in there that's a curveball that you wish you had known when you started.
yes, that is something I definitely recommend. And especially if you're doing like a more complicated shawl, and absolutely if you're doing a sweater pattern, always read it first, because sometimes all of a sudden those at the same time directions will catch you off guard, and you're like, uh-oh, like you're just not prepared for it. So, and I mean, I guess I write knitting patterns as a job, so I love reading through knitting patterns. So
I do
it's
too.
yeah, so I always will read through any pattern first, just to make sure, because sometimes, even us as experts, we don't know absolutely everything about everything in knitting. We know a lot of stuff, but maybe not every single thing. So sometimes I'm reading somebody else's sweater pattern, and I might not know exactly what something is, and I have to go look it up. So it's always good to get that knowledge beforehand, rather than when you're knitting it and you just want the project to be done so you can wear it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Oh, Joe D has a good question, and I would love to know your answer, Michelle. Do you purchase yarn with specific projects in mind?
Absolutely, yes.
Mm-hmm.
I won't let myself buy yarn until I'm ready to start the next thing.
Oh, wow.
And that's what, because otherwise it would be, I don't know if you can see the bins behind me, they're back there. They would be more than full. They're all full anyway. So if I just let myself buy yarn because I wanted to, I would feel guilty about every single thing that was back there.
Yeah.
So yes,
Yeah.
I'm very specific. It doesn't always work out, and that's why those things are full back there, because
Mm-hmm.
oh, this wasn't right for this, so I'll save it for something else, and then hopefully I go back and use it. But it doesn't always happen.
Yeah, I'm sort of the same. When it comes to buying a sweater quantity of yarn, I'm only like, if I go to, say, Rhinebeck, the New York Sheep and Wool Festival, which I don't live in New York, I live in Illinois. So like if I'm going there with my knitting friends and this is like our vacation for the fall, I will like go with a specific list of patterns to look for sweater quantities of yarn. I won't just buy a sweater quantity of yarn because I like the yarn. I will know, like, I want this yarn for this pattern. Sock yarn, on the other hand, that seems to come into the house at an alarming rate.
And I don't knit socks really with sock
Mhm.
weight yarn because I'm such a loose knitter. I'd have to go
Mhm.
down to zeros, and I hate that. But
Mhm.
sock weight yarn that turns into shawls, I
Mhm.
will admit to having some of those just kind of wander in, and then sometimes you have to find the perfect thing to go with
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like a few years ago, the one skein sock yarn shawls were like popular, but
Yeah,
then it started to become popular to make bigger shawls, because
too.
for most people, a one skein shawl is too small, they
Yeah.
want their shawl a little bigger. So yeah, now it's sometimes when when I see a yarn and have a shawl in mind, I buy 2 or 3 skeins, but I don't know what the
Yes.
shawl's going to ever look like.
I'm
Um,
not ready for the 4 skein shawl. I have a 2 skein attention span. So
yeah,
I'm good with a 2 skein shawl. That's it.
yeah, 2 skeins. That's what this one is here. That's a good way of putting it. I have the attention span for a 2 skein shawl. I like that. Let's see. Corrine would like to know, what are the best generic sized circular needles to use? Like, she means, like, are bamboo better than aluminum? Like, if you were just going to get one kind of circular needle, what would you recommend? Oh, do we lose Michele again? Oh, we did. Okay, well, I can answer this one again. So for me, I mean, that's a really tough call. I would say whatever you like to use as far as regular straight needles go, that's what I would get for circular needles. I personally, right now, am on an aluminum needle kick. That's just what I really like to use. So the vast majority of my circular needles are aluminum needles. The thing about it is also depends on what type of yarn you're using. Because if you're someone that knits with, say, a lot of silk or bamboo or something where the yarn is very slippery and you want to use a circular needle, you might find that your stitches are sliding off your needle a little too easily. And in that case, you would probably want bamboo or some other type of wood. But if you're knitting with a lot of cottons and linens, you might find that maybe those wood needles, your stitches are sticking a little too much and you might want the aluminum. So just think about what you want to knit with your circular needles, and that's a good way to decide what sort of material you want. And we do have some videos on the Knitting Circle about, and a blog post too, talking about the different material types of needles. And so that might help you to make a decision on what type of needle you want to buy. Catherine is suggesting transparent colored tape is great for charts. Yes, so that's very similar to the highlighter tape too. Do we have you sound back now, Michele? Oh no, I can't hear you still. Okay, bummer. Dolores wants to know, was that Knit Companion 2? I do think that there are 2 versions of Knit Companion. One is free and one is paid. So the paid one, obviously, you have a lot more features where you can, move things around and get your pattern exactly how you want. But definitely check it out. If you're somebody that likes technology incorporated into your knitting. Let's see. And then Debbie is asking, I've never put in a safety line before, but would like to know the best technique to use for when I do. She's getting frustrated with having to undo rows a stitch at a time. So when I am doing the safety line or lifeline, whatever you want to call it, there's a few different ways you can do it. You can, and we actually have a video on this on the Knitting Circle. So you can either take a yarn. I would recommend a smooth yarn, preferably in a different color than what your project is. I get that sometimes you might not have that available, but a smooth yarn. Some people even use plain dental floss, not minty dental floss, just plain. And you put it on your tapestry needle, and then you can run it under the stitches on your needle. And then what I like to do when I use the lifeline is I actually make that string really, really long, and then I tie it into a knot so that it's like looped so that it, like, one end of the string won't come out. And then the other thing you can do is I don't have one within arm's reach, but there are some knitting needles, circular knitting needles, where there's actually like a little hole where you can run a thin yarn or dental floss through it. And as you're knitting, the waste yarn, lifeline, safety line will work right through your stitches. I typically just use the method with the tapestry needle and running it under the stitches on the needle all the way across. Now, when I am using these lifelines, what I like to do is only put them in every few rows. Don't put your lifeline in every row or 2 rows, because then you're just spending all your knitting time putting in that lifeline. So I always think about it in terms of lace, because that's what I knit the most of. So if I'm knitting a shawl, I might put in the lifeline right before I'm going to start one of the charts. And then so when I'm moving to the next chart, if things are messed up, then I know I just have to like pull out that one chart. You know what I mean? So, or if, if the chart is really long, maybe you do put in another lifeline halfway through. But just, in a spot where it makes sense. So that's why I like to do it sort of at the beginning of where I'm going to be starting the chart, because I know if I mess up, now I'm just ripping all that out and going right back to row one. But if you need some more help with that, definitely check out that video on the knitting circle. And then Michele actually stuck a question in the chat about what about lifelines and stitch markers. So if you have stitch markers in there, that's a really good point. If you have the stitch markers in there, the stitch markers are also going to get caught. You want to make sure that you're taking your lifeline through the stitch markers so that your stitch markers also get caught in the lifeline as well, because otherwise they're good. Oh, she's saying no to that. Okay, well, we'll talk to her about that one when we have her on next time. So that's all the questions that I'm seeing for today. So thanks everybody for joining us. I'm sorry we had a little bit of technical difficulty with Michele, but we will have her on again. She's such a great knitting expert. I've learned so much from her. She's really got me sort of wanting to learn brioche. That's another thing she's really good at. So we'll get her on soon talking about that. And if you haven't already, don't forget to check out the link to get our summer striped dishcloth pattern, which you can download for free and knit for you and all your friends. So thanks so much for joining me again. I'm Jen Lucas, managing editor of the Knitting Circle, and I'll see everyone next month. Bye.